Welcome to Life Stories. Sometimes, fate has a way of leading us to the most unexpected moments that change our lives forever. On a cold autumn night, billionaire Ethan Carter stumbles upon a shocking discovery: 3 abandoned infants hidden deep in the woods. As he takes them into his home, unanswered questions linger. Who left them, and why? When a mysterious woman appears at his doorstep, battered and desperate, the truth begins to unravel, one that will test love, resilience, and the power of second chances. Subscribe now to Life Stories and join us as we begin today's incredible journey. The night was colder than usual, a crisp autumn breeze weaving through the trees surrounding my estate in Vermont. I had always found solace in the quiet of the woods. There was something about the way the wind rustled through the leaves, the way the world hushed when the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. It was one of the few places where the weight of my life didn't press so hard against my chest. But that night, the silence was shattered. At first, I thought I had imagined it, a cry, distant yet piercing, cutting through the stillness like a blade. I stopped mid-step, my breath curling in the cold air as I listened. The wind whispered through the branches, and for a moment, I convinced myself it was nothing more than my own thoughts playing tricks on me. And then I heard it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Thin, wretched, and unmistakably human. A child. My pulse quickened as I turned toward the sound, scanning the dense underbrush. No one should have been out here. The woods surrounding my estate stretched for miles, wild and untamed, a natural barrier between my world and the one beyond it. There were no roads, no trails that led to this part of the land. A third cry, weaker this time. I pushed forward, my leather shoes sinking into the damp earth, the uneven ground littered with fallen branches and tangled roots. I barely noticed. My mind was already racing ahead, imagining the worst: some desperate mother abandoning a newborn, an injured hiker stranded without help, a lost child too far from home. And then I saw it. Nestled among the brush, barely hidden beneath a crude layer of leaves and branches, was a basket, a cheap, worn wicker basket, its frayed edges softened by dampness. I exhaled sharply, my breath stalling in my throat. Inside, wrapped in thin, threadbare blankets that did little to guard them against the creeping cold, were 3 infants. 3. For a long moment, I couldn't move. They were so small, too small. Their tiny faces were flushed red from exposure, their limbs stiff with the effort of clinging to warmth. One of them, a boy with a tuft of dark hair, let out another soft whimper, his tiny fists shaking against the chill. My hands hovered above them, hesitant, unsure. Who would do this? Who would leave them here, alone, in the middle of the woods with nothing but brittle blankets to shield them from the cold? I carefully peeled back the damp fabric, my fingers brushing against a tiny palm. Instinctively, one of the babies latched onto me, gripping my finger with all the desperate strength of something that refused to let go. A strange tightness coiled in my chest. I swallowed hard, glancing around. There had to be something: footprints, discarded belongings, any sign of who had left them here. But there was nothing, only the forest, vast and unfeeling, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, the wind carrying the faintest hint of rain. There was no time to waste. I lifted the basket carefully, adjusting my hold so the weight of it, the physical and the unspoken, settled deep into my bones. The babies barely stirred, exhausted from the effort of simply existing in this cruel, indifferent night. I turned back toward the house, my steps measured, deliberate. The cold pressed in, but I barely felt it. My mind was already racing ahead: how to care for them, who to call, what this meant. Because whatever had brought these children into my path, one thing was certain: my life would never be the same again. The walk back to the house felt longer than it should have. The basket in my arms was heavier than its actual weight, the reality of what I was carrying pressing down on me with every step. 3 children, alone, abandoned. The grand estate loomed ahead, its warm glow spilling through the windows, a stark contrast to the cold night pressing against my back. As I pushed open the heavy oak doors, the warmth of the house rushed over me, but it did little to ease the tension coiled in my chest. Margaret, my housekeeper, had worked for me for nearly a decade, her sharp wit and steady hands the only real sense of home I had known since childhood. She was halfway across the foyer when she caught sight of me, her expression shifting from its usual calm to sheer disbelief. "My God," she whispered. I stepped further inside, my coat dusted with dirt, my shoes caked in damp earth. But none of that mattered. I set the basket down on the couch as carefully as I could. My movements measured, deliberate, as if I were handling something fragile. Because I was. Margaret was at my side in an instant, her gaze flicking from me to the children. Her years of experience as both a caretaker and a woman who had seen too much in life allowing her to process what I had not yet managed to. "They're freezing," I murmured, my voice steadier than I felt. Margaret didn't hesitate. She disappeared into the living room, stirring the embers in the grand fireplace back to life. Within minutes, flames licked at the cold air, chasing the chill away. I reached for the first baby, the same one who had gripped my finger in the woods. His skin was warm now, but his little body still trembled against the thin fabric wrapped around him. Margaret returned with blankets, her hands working on instinct as she gently took the second baby into her arms. She barely spoke, but I could see the questions in her eyes. Questions I had no answers to. "Where did you find them?" she finally asked. Breaking the silence. "The forest." The words felt heavy, unreal. Someone left them there. No note, no sign of a mother. Margaret's expression darkened. "Abandoned?" I exhaled, shaking my head. "I don't know, but someone did this deliberately." She met my gaze then, something hard and unyielding settling in her eyes. "Whoever did this, they weren't careless." The thought sat between us, thick and unspoken. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Only the crackling fire and the occasional soft whimper from the infants filled the room. Then, Margaret straightened, hands on her hips. "They need to eat." I watched as she disappeared into the kitchen, moving with the precision of a woman who had long since learned that shock and sentimentality wouldn't change what needed to be done. And as I sat there, cradling a child that wasn't mine, I realized something with startling clarity. I couldn't walk away from this. The following days passed in a haze of uncertainty. The babies, 3 boys, as Margaret had discovered, were fragile. Their cries small but insistent. Their need for care all-consuming. I had never held an infant before that night. Never fed one. Never watched as tiny fingers curled around mine in blind trust. And yet, here I was, navigating midnight feedings and restless whimpers as if my life had always been meant for this. But questions haunted me. Who had left them, and why? The security team searched the woods for answers, footprints, discarded belongings, anything, but they found nothing. No sign of a struggle. No evidence of a mother in distress. Whoever had left them behind had vanished like a ghost. And then, just when I thought the mystery would remain unsolved, she arrived. It was late. The estate had settled into a quiet hum, the fire in the living room casting long shadows against the walls. Margaret had just taken the last baby upstairs when a knock echoed through the grand foyer. A strange kind of foreboding settled over me as I crossed the room. I pulled the door open. She stood there, barely upright, her body trembling against the night air. She was young, no older than her mid-20s. Her face gaunt and bruised. Her lips split and swollen. Damp, torn fabric clung to her thin frame, her collarbone jutting out beneath the weight of exhaustion. But it was her eyes that struck me most, wide, hollow, desperate. For a second, her gaze met mine before shifting past me, into the house, to the playpen in the corner of the room, where the babies lay sleeping. A sharp, uneven breath left her lips. Then, as if her body had held itself together just long enough to reach this doorstep, she collapsed. Margaret's sharp inhale was nearly drowned by the wind slamming the door shut behind us. I caught the woman before she hit the floor, her skin ice cold, her body unnaturally light. "Get a blanket," I ordered, lifting her easily. and something warm to drink. Margaret didn't hesitate. As I carried the woman across the threshold, my mind raced. Who was she? Why had she come? And then, just as I laid her on the couch, she stirred, her fingers twitching weakly against the fabric. A single word escaped her lips. Noah. I froze. The name, the same one I had seen on the tattered tag wrapped around one of the babies. She knew them. I stared down at her, my pulse hammering. The mystery was no longer a mystery. The past had just arrived at my doorstep. She woke with a start, eyes darting around the dimly lit living room, her breathing ragged as if she had been running in her sleep. Panic flared in her expression the moment she saw me. She tried to sit up, but her body betrayed her, weak, battered, exhausted beyond reason. Easy, I said, raising a hand to show I meant no harm. You're safe here. Her eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering beneath the exhaustion. Then, as if remembering why she was here, she twisted toward the playpen in the corner. The 3 boys were still asleep, bundled in warm blankets, their tiny chests rising and falling in soft, steady breaths. She let out a choked sound, half a sob, half a sigh of relief. They're alive, she whispered, as if she had convinced herself they wouldn't be. I watched as her fingers gripped the edge of the couch, knuckles turning white. It was clear she had been through hell. What's your name? I asked. She hesitated, swallowing hard before answering. Lauren. Lauren. The name suited her, though it carried the weight of something lost. Margaret returned with a steaming cup of tea and a blanket, her eyes scanning Lauren the way a mother looks at a child she fears has been hurt too many times. She draped the blanket over her thin shoulders, and for a moment, Lauren closed her eyes, as if savoring the warmth. Then I asked the question I had been holding back since she arrived. Are they yours? Her breath hitched. When she looked at me, her eyes were glassy with unshed tears. Yes. Something inside me settled. The pieces were finally falling into place. Who left them in the woods? I pressed, though I already knew the answer. Lauren's fingers curled into the fabric of the blanket. I did. The admission landed between us like a weight too heavy to lift. Margaret inhaled sharply, but I held up a hand to stop her from speaking. Lauren's gaze dropped to her lap, shame curling her shoulders inward. I didn't want to, she murmured, but I had no choice. Silence filled the room, stretching long and thick between us. Then, slowly, haltingly, she began to speak. Her father, Frank, had been a gambler, a reckless man who never knew when to stop. His debts piled higher than he could pay. And when desperation came knocking, he sold the only thing he had left, his daughter, to Vincent Malone, a man with power, money, and a cruelty that ran bone deep. For 5 years, Lauren had been his property. And when she gave birth to his children, he had made his intentions clear. The babies were not a blessing. They were a commodity. He had planned to sell them. Her voice broke as she recounted how she had waited for the perfect moment. How she had taken them in the dead of night, running into the woods with nothing but thin blankets and a desperate prayer that someone, anyone, would find them before it was too late. I stared at her, the firelight flickering against her hollowed cheeks, and knew one thing for certain. She had fought to save them. And now, she was still fighting. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained. Lauren stayed. At first, it was out of necessity. Her body was too weak, her wounds too fresh. But as the days turned to weeks, something shifted. She no longer flinched at shadows. She no longer slept with one foot ready to run. She let herself exist, not just as a survivor, but as a mother. And I was no longer just a man who had stumbled upon 3 abandoned children in the woods. Somewhere between the sleepless nights, the quiet moments, the whispered reassurances, something deeper took root. I had built my life on control, on numbers, on deals that turned profit into power. But love, true, selfless love, was something I had never known. Until now, the children grew stronger, their cries became laughter, their tiny hands reaching for mine. For Lauren's, for a future that had once seemed impossible. One evening, as the fire crackled low and the scent of fresh baked bread drifted from the kitchen. I found Lauren standing by the window, watching the boys as they played on the plush rug. She turned when she felt my gaze. Something unspoken passing between us. She didn't need to say it. I already knew. This was home now. This was love. And as I stepped forward, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, I realized something. I hadn't just saved them that night in the woods. They had saved me too. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Life Stories for more incredible tales of resilience, love, and second chances. See you in the next video.